Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out insightsinsound.com for a full list of our podcasts and YouTube series.
My guest is Thaddeus Corea. He is a musician, producer, drummer, musical director. That's one of your pedigrees, actually, is former MD of Blue Man Group, correct?
No, I was never the MD, but I did play a lot of instruments there.
Okay, that's an interesting one. We'll get into that too. But first, let's dig into a little bit of your musical background.
Oh, sure.
You are the son of a well-known musician, Chick Corea.
Yes.
And I'm interested in how that did that make you feel obligated to me? Did it make you interested in music? Did it turn you off completely to music?
Well, I'll preface it by saying now, looking back over everything, I would say that I feel like maybe to some little degree, we, as spirits, as souls, we sort of have something to do with where we end up.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think to some small degree, perhaps larger with some people, less so with other people, you kind of choose your parents.
Yeah.
And in the way that I feel like my dad chose his parents, where they had only one son, and he was brilliantly talented from day one. Mm-hmm. He was born to a father who is a professional musician and a mother with a singular ferocity to both support and protect her son.
Uh-huh.
So he kind of picked the perfect environment for himself. And so when you ask how did being Chick's son affect me with music, I think there's a subtext of, I feel like that's where I was meant to be. For sure, there were so many positive aspects. I got to grow up. When I say grow up, I mean from little to like 5, 6, where, you know, when rehearsals were taking place at home, back then might have been Circle or something like that, I got to just hang out in the room, or I'd be laying under the piano. It was one of my favorite places to hang out in a rehearsal.
I can see that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Little baby grand or a grand or something like that, I would hang out under the piano. Being that close to that creative process, like getting an understanding of like, it would be like
the development of ideas and stuff.
Yeah.
Watching that happen. Yeah, that's got to be fascinating.
It's like being a little kid at a ranch and like growing up to be a cowboy. You've known since you were little how it goes.
Right.
The regular order of things, you know, getting together, how you greet each other as musicians, how you listen to each other properly, how you react to each other, what's okay to say, what's not okay to say. And I get to say that because we all know the level of Chick Corea and what he ascended to. There's no question, you know, he's in the history books.
Yeah.
So I know for a fact he did it a way that succeeds. I can't say the right way. There's 1,000 right ways.
There's no right way, but
I learned all of those kinds of things, absorbed those things. And then when I was a little bit older, not old enough to go to clubs, but we were going to clubs. Mm-hmm. And we go and get to sit at I was describing to you before, right? Like get to sit, and the stage is only 4 inches up off the ground.
Right.
And you have little cocktail tables.
And you're right there.
And you're right there. And you're, you know, and you're watching the musicians sweat and work and listen to each other and play, and you're listening to the audience freak out at places. As a little kid, you know, understanding when somebody was soloing, what did that mean? Oh, this is their turn to express themselves.
Yeah.
And then hearing the audience all clap when the solo was done, like it just becomes an understanding that you understand, oh, he was saying things now, and now we're listening, and oh, he's done saying things now, and like, hey, thank you, that was great. And then the next person is saying things, and the overall song is saying things. And yeah, so I would say it was it's hard to overstate how important being in the orbit of my dad somewhere was a part of my musical growth.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, before the musical aspect of it, you mentioned the creative process of it, because that to me is, I think, what really, at least for me personally, that's what drew me to music. It wasn't the learning process. It wasn't the left brain stuff. Mm-hmm. It was the right brain stuff. It was the watching, the communication that one has with other musicians. That's a romance. You know, that's a meeting of the minds on a higher level. And it's interesting that you really grew up with that as almost an intuitive thing.
I feel very lucky that the genre that I grew up inside of was jazz, because the process of creating a melody, just doodle-a-doo, and there's the melody, and then embellishing and growing it and everything like that. Mm-hmm. Getting to see that from the beginning, and understanding that, at least for my dad, it was a very simple and direct from himself, and how he thought it was an easy flow. It wasn't a like labored thing. It wasn't drinking and drugs. It wasn't taking something from my childhood and like expressing it in the
trauma.
It wasn't anything but joy.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, there are other ways to write, and certainly some of those ways are common to us.
And
but I grew up knowing, because you know, as a kid, you know it's possible if mom and dad show you it's possible, or if they show you people that show it's possible. Mm-hmm. Then you're like, oh, well, that's easy, that's possible. I just saw it done. I know it's possible.
Right.
So I saw that the process of writing and the creative process and the playing process of interacting with other players, like you say, it becomes an intuitive knowledge after a while. You're like, oh, well, it's weird if you don't do that.
Interesting. Because a lot of people don't get that. And in fact, that's, you know, we were talking about teaching, and we've both taught. Sometimes what you see in younger people who are just coming up is a lack of that understanding. And part of that is, you know, that they're growing up in a completely different environment than we did. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily even have the experience of playing with other people, but they approach the creative process differently because of that, I think. Mm-hmm. And so you really did have some great fortune to be witnessing that at a very young age, when it would ingrain within you so deeply.
I think so. Mm-hmm. It definitely affects. I mean, it's foundational for me. It's cornerstone for me that art is a form of communication.
Oh, absolutely.
And that it's a very powerful. I mean, certainly spiritual, but it's a powerful communication. It's not just the news. It's something that is orders of magnitude more powerful. And for me, of course, that's incredibly interesting, right? Like you listen to one song and it moves you. Mm-hmm. You might not even know what the words were, but the overall thing that came at you, like, just moved you.
Oh yeah.
Or it makes you shake your ass, or whatever. That power is just so interesting.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, and not even understanding it. I think one of the things that I was really blown away by was when I started discovering international music, shall we say, music from other countries,
And you don't
where
know what it
I have no
means,
idea
right?
what the hell you're singing about, but oh my God, I want to cry.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
think and actually it's funny, one of my first exposures to that was I had a girlfriend, I think I was about 20 years old, and I had a girlfriend from Belgium. And she turned me on to Nina Hagen,
Yeah, I remember.
and who I was fortunate enough to meet later on in life. And
neat.
she's absolutely everything that you think she is,
Cool.
But listening to this, I'm blown away by the power and the visceral nature of it. And I have no idea what the hell she's singing about, but damn, And I think, in that sense, yeah, music is definitely that universal emotional thing, and it's interesting as we start learning to play an instrument, as we start learning to master an instrument, because you have to go left brain to a certain extent
Yeah.
in order to master the techniques and stuff like that. How that ties into that whole right brain emotion-led aspect of it. It's almost like you get to a point where you can do something, you can execute something on an instrument, and you go, wow, that's cool. And and all of a sudden, the creative, the right brain takes over. It's kind of,
you when you're talking about that, it just immediately makes me think about practice, and it could be practicing anything. Drums is my number one instrument, but I think about, because you brought up my dad's influence on me, and practice was an interesting influence from him, because it wasn't it was very specific, really specific. There were ways to effectively practice, and there were ways to not effectively practice. And I mean, he had been practicing since he was 3 or 4 years old, so he had experienced a lot of different ways to practice piano. And he taught me a lot about practicing something. But you were bringing up also, when it shifts from left brain to right brain, and I'm not sure that he ever expressed it that way, but anybody that's ever listened to my dad's music or seen him play wouldn't say like, oh, he's just a technical executor, and it's just scales, and no, it's very emotional.
yeah, I would agree.
It has a lot of spirituality to it, a lot of communication to it, but his practice techniques were not so much like that. It was like very much like teaching the body how to do the thing with the least effort possible. And
Interesting.
in that less effort meant you could get more speed. And the things he taught me about practicing were very not about like emotion or spirit until you started to get the physicality of it. Without being able to do it physically, putting more gusto into it or pouring your heart into it doesn't help it communicate what you intended it to communicate.
Right.
If
The
you
vision
can't-
is in your head, but you can't necessarily bring it to your muscles.
Yeah, so you have to get the muscles to be able to play the thing. And he would describe to me, like he being able to do this thing, and he was talking about, very slow and methodical, and with a flow, a very, it shouldn't be janky or jumpy, and everything he was talking about was physical actions until it started to become easy. And then he would always say, now use it. Now,
Take it and run with it.
yeah, like if I was learning a drum fill, he'd say, okay, now if we were playing a groove, how would you use that? And it's like the practicing meant nothing if you weren't going to use it.
Right.
And then the practicing should only be for things that you're going to use.
Uh-huh.
So it kind of all just narrowed down, but it led to, it's a thing that you need to be able to use in that moment of communicating and emotion and spirit.
Makes sense. It's interesting that you approach it that way, though, because I think, there are a lot of musicians who are the musical equivalent of book smart. Musicians who you can throw the most complex piece of sheet music in front of them they've never seen before, and they can just go, boom. Exactly,
Yeah.
And yet you say to them, okay, take 8 bars. They freeze.
Sure.
And then there's the opposite, and I'm in that camp. I'm the epitome of that joke of how do you get someone to turn down, put sheet music in front of them, and yet I learned everything by ear, and improvisationally speaking, I'm much more comfortable. And I think there's, again, those are two different camps, but they're two different sides of the same coin. Because which works for you, which rules in that sense, and for me, I think it's just a matter of impatience. I never had the discipline to practice every day. And that's funny. I remember having a conversation recently with John Storick, and John was telling me that he said, relatively new friend in his life was Herb Alpert, and he said, I asked Herb, I said, do you still play? He looked at me like I had 2 heads. He said, of course, I play every day.
Yeah.
And there are these
Herb
brilliant
must
musicians.
Be 85?
I think he's almost 90.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, point being, is it practice at that point, or is it just for your enjoyment? I don't know, I remember there's a brilliant line that someone told me about, I think it was Pablo Casals. Someone asked him, why do you still practice at the age of 88 or whatever it was? And he said, I think I'm starting to get good at it. But at a certain point, it's almost, it's you need it. You need it to just round out your day or whatever it is, But I think that's part of it, isn't it?
Pablo Casal, when we're talking about Herb Alpert, Pablo Casal, my dad, why would they still practice?
Right.
I know exactly why, with regard to my dad, because he was always pushing his own boundaries. So when he started, he always loved classical music, but when he started wanting to, exchange with the world, sort of his take on Mozart or his take on some of this classical, he needed to practice to be able to pull it off, because it's a different set of muscular skills.
Yeah, of course.
And he practiced it wasn't just sitting around on a couch. He was practicing he was only doing what was necessary to be able to do it at this level. So it wasn't just casual, just warm this up. He was going for blood. He wanted to be able to play at a level that is, where he felt good about it. So that's why he would practice. But also, I know for myself, paradiddles or, whatever little snare drum practice, sure, it's warming up my muscles, and sure, making sure things are still sharp, and that's true. But also, I think, this is me now, I think that there's a certain thing to practice that is a little bit meditative, in that you assert yourself that you're not thinking about this or that, you're not going grocery shopping right now, you have sat and you've decided the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or 4 hours is going to be only about improving your skills. So you've already started meditating.
Right. It's
You've
focus.
already said, okay, just going to be here and do this now, and I'm going to do this paradiddle that I've done my whole life.
Right.
But I'm going to actually look at it right now and try to make sure it's as smooth and correct as possible. I'm going to notice my hands, make sure things are doing it correctly. It's kind of meditative.
You're talking about something that's called the beginner's mind.
What's
Yes.
that?
The beginner's mind is basically being fully present.
Yeah.
For example, if you're a painter, you're going to immerse yourself in the feeling of what does this brush feel like on the canvas. You know, if you're a pianist, you could hit one note and just explore what's the timbre of this note, you know, and that, I think in certain ways, it blocks out everything else, and it gives you a certain focus, and it gives you a different perspective on what is it that I'm doing? What is it that I'm focusing on here? And I think that's really, it's not only great for the creative process, but I think it's also really, as you say, it's meditative, it focuses the brain. I have found in, you know, as we were talking earlier, I do a lot of work with especially younger people with neurodiversity challenges. And a lot of times that helps to focus, you know, the attention span that's flying all over the place, you know, just be fully present right now with this one thing. And that's exactly what you're talking about. It's
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know where this is fully corroborated, but I think that, like when we say, so that action, it helps focus your brain. It helps, you know, it helps diminish your scatteredness, your focusing. But I think that that action and that ability to shut things out or stop thinking about the groceries or the taxes is also a skill.
It's a learned skill.
A learned skill.
Yeah.
It's not an intuitive skill. It's a learned skill.
Yeah.
You get better at focusing the more you practice focusing. You get better at it.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
so, you know, I mean, I sit down to do paradiddles. Sure, my paradiddles will get better. Or I hope. But what I'm also doing is practicing that focus and
Yeah.
the ability to focus and the ability to be right here, right now with this snare drum and with these drumsticks is a skill that I believe, even if my paradiddles didn't get that much better, my skill of that focus got better. And that skill of focus, I think, is also a skill that we use when we perform.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
yeah.
we are here with this audience.
And with the fellow musicians that we're
We're
working
here with our
yeah.
fellow musicians.
Yeah.
You know, we're not somewhere else. And I feel like when you get better and better at that skill, you also recognize when it's not happening.
That's a fair point.
You know, like
you
you sit down to play with the fellas and you get it going and ooh, that gosh darn it,
Oh, what am I
I didn't
gonna
pay
have for
my
lunch?
electric
Yeah,
bill.
you know,
and
right, yeah.
That guy really bothered me in the taxi. And,
Yeah.
and it's going like this, and you're like, you know what? That needs to go.
Yeah, it's true, and that is a learned skill, being able to shut that out. You know, it's like meditation. You know, and I've always laughed about this because I personally have a hard time meditating because I have a hard time shutting that off. You know, and at the same time, I realize
you know you're the only one that has a hard time doing.
Of course, absolutely,
Of course,
I know that. Yeah, but I also know that. Those of us who have that kind of challenge are the ones for whom it would do the most good.
Absolutely.
You know, but again, you know, you're fighting against these things that they're ingrained in your brain. You know, and the fact that we are so multifaceted, the fact that we are focused on so many different things, it almost works against us because, you know, yeah, I got other things popping into my brain 24/7. You know, so
well, does that not make you think about the music making process currently, software?
Oh yeah.
And
the
availability of options at any given moment.
The
within
over
the software,
availability of options.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right?
And in fact, that's interesting. That's a conversation I was having with someone the other day. The paralysis of analysis that happens when you all of a sudden have 400 virtual synths in your computer. You know, and wow. Which particular clav sound do I want, you know? And you could spend so much time, you know, we used to have a joke at the studio. It was like, you know, yeah, if this person wants to listen to 14 different reverbs, that's fine because we're being charged by the hour.
That's right.
You know, but that's really what it comes down to is ultimately you're zoomed into something That is an important detail right then and there at that moment. But do you zoom back out? You know, do you consider the big picture of, is anybody really going to care that I just did this really bitchin' hi-hat figure? You know, maybe if it's central to the song, you know, like a Stuart Copeland thing, central to the song, cool, that's great, you know. But 9 times out of 10, nobody's going to give a shit about that. You know, your snare sound is not going to make or break the song, you know, and yet, how much time do we spend obsessing over that?
Yeah.
You know?
Say you've decided you have 20 hours to finish this song. Are you really allowed to spend an hour on the snare drum?
Right, exactly.
Is that prudent? Does that make sense?
You know, and what's that old joke, you know, nobody ever goes home humming the snare drum.
I've never heard that one, but it couldn't be more true.
Yeah, you know, I mean, that's the thing. Yes, it's important. It's absolutely important that all the components of the song fit together in a certain way. Well, but it's all about the song.
Absolutely, right? Availability of options. It's not that availability of options is a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing, right? Mm-hmm. We can do so many things right now.
Oh, yeah.
New music producers, and I think it's like pretty much now, because of the availability of software, an artist is a music producer.
Oh, yeah.
And so the availability of options is not necessarily bad, but if we take a page from our past of the era of 4 tracks or 8 tracks, and understand that the artist now, you would think that part of the artist's intention is to finish a song in, I don't know, a month or a week or a day, whatever it is. They don't intend to be doing this for a year for one song.
We hope not.
So time is of some importance to how quickly we move along. The availability of options kills that schedule.
Yeah.
And the idea of making decisions is very important to moving at a certain speed. And I think that the making decisions thing is... Ooh, I'm sorry, I'm scratching a microphone. The making decisions thing is not like... It doesn't have to be a hard and fast rule or anything, but when you make a decision, I feel like you have opened up a part of your mind that is now available for new creation.
For different decisions.
Yeah.
Ensuing decisions.
Instead of like being in a moment in the music production where you're like, oh, I'm not totally sure if I'm done with the bass drum and snare drum. You know, that bass sound, we might just reamp it through a thing. And the backup singers haven't really arrived on their parts yet. Like, there's so many indecisions that aren't finished.
Yeah.
How is there room for creating right now in this moment?
Well, you know, you talk about the limitations aspect of it. You know, if you think about, we always go back to the Beatles. Because,
they kind of showed us how rock and roll,
exactly.
Beatles,
and a lot of that was those brilliant engineers.
Yeah.
You know, guys like Jeff Emmerich. You know, I mean, but you know, if I think about that, you're right. It's making decisions and it's committing to certain things because you had to.
Committed.
You had to.
Yeah.
You know, you only have this many tracks, and I think, you know, for example, you have, let's say, 2 tracks left on the tape for your vocal. That's brilliant right there because you have 2 chances, you know. Now, basically, nobody brings their A game. You know, if I'm going to cut a vocal, I can cut that vocal 400 times and then comp together little pieces of, you know, and people who do that, you know, I remember seeing a video of Phineas cutting up a vocal of his sisters, you know, and just the syllables.
Yeah.
And absolutely, that's brilliant, but is that a performance? It is, but it's not a one-shot performance. Did she bring her A game to that vocal, you know, as opposed to somebody who just cuts the whole thing in one performance? You know, it's a different...
In her case,
neither one's invalid, you know. They both do have validity. they're just different. They're different approaches.
Well, in her case, she obviously has the ability to perform it.
Oh, no question.
But in the case of when your music production is creating a performance out of, it's almost still in the songwriting phase.
Yeah, yeah.
You're like, I kind of liked it when you sung that part with that other note, and then you just get in there and you can do it. And because our software is so amazing now, you can do it like pretty convincingly.
Yes.
In the end, does it matter? As long as it moves you in the end, as long as, like, when you hear playback, you're bobbing your head, as long as all of your friends are like, what? That sounds amazing.
Absolutely.
Does it matter? I don't know. But then, you know, as a manager of an artist who is the product, kind of, you know, can your artist do that thing that you just created?
That's just it. That's just it. You know, can you do that live? You know,
Yeah.
because if you can go in and do a single vocal performance live, maybe it's not the best performance ever, but if you can do that, you know, and if I believe you, that's the thing. You know, I don't care if you've got no auto-tune, if you're slightly, you know, microtonal here and there, whatever. Do I believe you?
Oh,
You know, and if I believe you, that's all that really matters.
That credibility is incredibly important, but it's also very genre specific.
Oh, absolutely.
I
Sure.
mean, when I listen to Chris Stapleton,
Yeah.
that I would be very surprised, you know, if that's like a Frankenstein take.
Oh, I can tell you
No
for
way.
sure because I've talked to Vance about
Vance.
this. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Vance has told me, no, I set up the mics and I get out of the
Press
way.
record, yeah.
Yep. He said, in fact, Vance had this great line that he cracked me up. He said, I tell my assistants, put it in record first and then set up the mics.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's really true because you're capturing something there that is specifically made to be live, warts and all.
Yeah.
You know,
I
and that's
mean,
a different
and-
type of, it's a different genre.
A different genre, and
know.
that genre, if I'm be so bold, with my own opinion, that genre and some other genres require credibility.
Agreed. Yeah.
Or it doesn't sound right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would even say, like, you know, you say warts and all, and true, okay, I suppose if you got out a micrometer and measured things, you would say, well, that's a wart or that's a wart. But of course, as consumers that love music, we're like, there's no warts.
No.
But if you're in a genre like, I don't know, if you're in EDM or if you're in pop, you know,
You want Max Martin?
is it credibility? Like, do I really have to believe that Kesha can actually perform a particular vocal line? No. I just want it to, like, make me feel like moving.
Right. Exactly. And that is the point right there. I think is that certain genres of music require different touches to them, and absolutely. And as I say, it's all valid. You know, I don't cast aspersions at any particular type of music in that sense. You know, there's different processes for creating each of them. As long as it's coming from the heart as art, that's what matters. And, you know, well, maybe you can say pop music doesn't do that. I don't know. It really depends on who you are and what kind of music you're making.
No, you can't say, for sure, you're right. You can't say, you know, pop music sucks because it doesn't have credibility. I wouldn't hate to be misunderstood in that way. Of course, all communication requires credibility because you need to, if you don't believe it, it's sort of like you're also not feeling it.
Right.
So it all requires credibility. But certain specific things are very genre specific, and
Right.
you know, and it's not to say that pop music doesn't have innovation or doesn't have new messages or new communication. It happens all the time.
Sure. And there's an audience for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be pop music, you know. I mean, you know, we can, a lot of us who are in the arts, you know, we snub our noses at, you know, the Katy Perrys and, the pop stars du jour. At the same time, hey, you know, somebody's buying it. and somebody's buying it because it's touching them. You know,
and it's touching a lot of people.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't judge in that sense. I'm comparing the creative processes therein, because
Very
that's
different.
what that's where we started this particular thread.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole range of what the creative process, and especially the recording process, is like in different genres.
Yeah.
And it's not rock and roll specific.
Right.
And it's not
at all.
Not at all, right? Like punk music and jazz music have a lot of similarities with how you'd record them.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Like
it's all organic.
Has to be real, has to be organic. Are we going to do that take again because the snare drum? No, we're not doing it again.
Right,
That
exactly.
was burning.
And if we go microtonal, hey, if something's out of tune, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to circle back to something else that you mentioned a minute ago, because we were talking about neurodiversity.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And I'm going to put you on the spot on something, because again, I'm going to go back to your upbringing.
Put me on the spot.
Okay. So you're growing up in the shadow of a well-known musician.
Giant.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk about imposter syndrome.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, when I was fueled by being very young and into my 20s, I don't think I felt that as much then. But then as adulthood and like actually making a living doing music, music production, or being a drummer, or of course that's a thought. But as that was a thought for me, I also, because having so many musician friends, knew it was kind of a thought for all of us. We all think that we're just, I mean, I'm saying we all do. I do have some friends who have no imposter syndrome whatsoever, and they know they are the shit. They're just unusual. There's not so many.
That's unusual, and sometimes I wonder if that is down to a lack of self-awareness.
But maybe that's a blissful thing.
Well, no doubt. No
Right?
doubt. And I envy
very-
them in that sense. Yeah.
Absolutely right. I have friends that are social butterflies and happy to be the biggest cheerleader of themselves to other people all the time.
Sure.
And
Social media is a blessing for them.
maybe sometimes we find them annoying, or maybe we, as I do, I look at them and I'm like, that is just, what's wrong with me? Why can't I do that? But yeah, imposter syndrome, I don't think is, I don't know if it's different for children of celebrities who are incredibly successful at the thing that the child wants to do. I don't know if it's 100% common. Like I've often wanted to chit chat with other children of successful musicians and be like, so what's your journey been like? Because mine's been weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, do you know Julian Coriel?
No.
I'll have to introduce you. That would be an interesting conversation between the two of you. I'd like to be a fly on the wall for that.
There's so many of us.
Yes.
And I don't know 99% of them, but like that would be really interesting to me to have a barbecue where Dweezil Zappa and Julian and just anybody that and of course there would be a jam session.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
But now let's look at the other side of that, because the imposter syndrome aspect there is not just I'll never be as good as my parent or whatever it is, but it's also, I think, you have, in addition to the aspirational aspect of it, you have this feeling of is this what I should do? Should I be doing something else?
Oh,
you know?
interesting. It never hit me that way. That's also understandable. But no, I mean, if anything, when I was youngest, my sister and I started on piano lessons. And and so my grandfather was teaching us music as he originally taught my dad, and teaching us very basic music books, and we would have our lesson every week, and it was quickly apparent to everyone, and then maybe finally apparent to me, that my ear outstretched my discipline. So I would, it would turn to page 3 of your very simple first piano book, and it would, the Swan Song or whatever.
Oh
And
God, I remember the Swan Song.
I feel like it was a common one. And, I would just remember how it went. And I would skip my finger across till I found the note that I remembered. That's the note. And then I was faking it.
Right.
I wasn't really reading.
That's funny. That's exactly what I did. Yeah.
My sister, however, who is an excellent pianist, she could actually read. She read on purpose, and she'd sit down and go, doodle-a-doo, and off she'd go, and I would, and then I'd be afraid to sit down, and I'd sit down and like, oh, I didn't practice this week. And so my response to that as a little kid was, I'm going to play a different instrument. So I switched to trumpet. And trumpet is single staff,
right?
So much easier
solo
reading.
Instrument,
yeah.
Monophonic.
And so I played trumpet for about 5 years, and I think along the way of trumpet, I remember seeing Maynard Ferguson at Cool Jazz Festival, and all up close. And that same weekend, I met George Benson. This is all as a little kid, and it was so cool. But somehow it was also about the time that I was like, I don't think trumpet's my instrument. I
didn't move you.
I was starting to listen to a lot more rock and roll, and I was starting to listen to Beatles and Stones, and just there wasn't any trumpet in it. So I was falling away from trumpet a little bit, but I didn't know. And then I had, and to point out, like imposter syndrome, in the beginning, I didn't choose piano because that's what Dad plays. That's just what was proper to start on.
Okay, yeah, of course.
In the family, it was no question. You start on that.
And musically speaking, it is, a full range instrument.
It's where you're supposed to start. It's
right.
laid out right there.
It's percussive as well. It's all those things, yeah.
So when I made my first choice away from piano, I felt somehow less pressure about my dad being a world-class pianist because I was playing trumpet. So this is something different. And maybe, I could play in his band one day or something like that. Like it didn't feel like it limited me. And then when I started being interested in drums driven music, I was like, I could play for my dad one day. It was never like, I'll never play for him one day. It was, in the back of my mind, that was a musical goal. Even though I only, that wasn't to be, but it didn't feel like I was in the wrong place or doing the wrong thing, or like, maybe this isn't for me, or like, I'm in a family of musicians, so I have to do this. I felt like I was in the right place, doing the right thing. However, I had a premonition when I was 9 years old, which I think little kids are still very aware of the cosmos somehow.
Yeah.
We talked about that, I think, the last time we talked, like, children are they're still not shut off from the spiritual world. I feel like they get things, and as they're
less filtered.
Less filtered.
Yeah.
as a little kid, 9 years old, I had a dream about, well, I didn't know what it was about, but I knew I saw this big black area and some little red lights here and there, and there was an ambiance of sound. Didn't know what any of it meant. The next week, I was at a concert of my dad's, one of the early ones. It was Return to Forever, and as I was sitting in the audience, because in those days, the ticketing was a little bit different, and
Yeah.
I would be backstage, and my dad's saying, "Do you want to go out front?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I'm going to go out front." And he'd, shuffle me to the manager. Manager would just sort of point me out the door and say, "Oh, there's a couple empty seats there. Go sit there."
Right.
So I run out to the audience and I sit. Lights are all down, and all of a sudden it hits me. Oh my goodness, this is my dream. I dreamt this, and I was having like a deja vu, and it was all black. And the little red lights were the lights from the amps, and the sound that I had heard in this dream was the ambience of the audience kind of hushedly talking amongst themselves and getting ready for the show to start, and then the lights coming up. It was a kind of a life-changing moment, because that night when I was watching Lenny White play, I was like, that's what I want to do.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so when I saw Lenny White playing, and it didn't ever really change for me. Lenny White is a drum hero to me.
You could do a hell of a lot worse.
Yeah. And so I that was but that was also a thing where the imposter syndrome of it wasn't in my mind at all as a kid, as a young adult, wasn't in there. Until, later, when you're struggling, when I was, struggling to pay bills, or I need to pay rent, or, is this the right thing? What am I doing?
Yeah, well, and that's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's typically where it kicks in, is when you're, as you say, as we get older, we become more filtered and more, there's more noise. And I think it's at that point that we really start facing these questions of, am I doing the right thing? Is this the right, am I on the right path, and all of that? And I think in certain ways, the better you are, the more that impacts you, because you have this raw talent. Is it marketable? Can I make a living at it? Can I, those are the less existential and more practical, pragmatic questions that start really kind of gnawing at you, I think.
Yeah. I mean, being an artist isn't...
it ain't for everybody.
It ain't for everybody. I mean, you there's no way to really be an artist and not struggle with issues that, now seems like is more understood, that it is has to do with mental health, and I don't think it's always been understood that way, but being an artist is not easy, and we're in a world where, what is the value of art? So it's a hard social situation right now. I think a hard cultural situation. Is music worth anything? Is art worth anything? Well, what is it worth? And how much do you care about getting how good at it, and why?
And that has definitely changed in, I'd say, the last 20 or 30 years especially, because even though, music has to be commodified, and it always has been commodified to a certain extent for the sake of those who make it.
Since Jerry Lee Lewis and
Exactly.
Sun Records.
Exactly.
Sun
Well,
City.
even, going back since Traveling Minstrels,
Okay,
I'll play
sure.
for my supper.
Yeah.
But we've now gotten to a point where music is somewhat dispensable and somewhat incidental. Does it still carry the same value? I don't know.
And when you say, does it carry the same value? Does it carry the same dollar value? Does it carry the same spiritual value?
Yeah.
And they're different questions.
Yes.
And both kind of important when you're trying to put food on the table.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or when you're having to work a day job in order to write some music or play with your band or go out and do some gigs at night. It's hard to develop your music and your skills to a level that will get you money when you're only doing it for an hour a night.
Right.
That is very, very challenging.
It is. It is. And then, going back to what you were talking about earlier about the whole creative process, if you're learning everything in a vacuum, which so many musicians today are, do you then gain that experience of playing off another person, of that whole interchange there? That I think to me would make or break whether or not I wanted to be a musician.
Ooh.
Because that value of, and again, I'm only speaking for myself. I know that there are plenty of musicians for whom, MIDI and technology are an absolute boon because I can do everything I want to do and I don't have the experience of having to deal with crap bandmates and all of that stuff and all the soap opera that goes with that. And I absolutely get that. And I've done that and I've been that musician. I totally get that. I admire, musicians like Prince or Stevie Wonder who could hear the whole thing in their head and then lay it down, That's amazing to me. At the same time, I think what drew me to music personally was that interchange with other people, and especially, you're a drummer, you understand it as a bass player. To me, that was the connection right there.
Brothers.
We are the engine. We're driving this thing, and we're kind of driving it from behind, And so, I don't know if I would value that the same way. Now, again, maybe it comes down to what you know.
Well, I have a son who's a guitarist and a guitar teacher, and I'm looking at, and a lot of the clients that come in and record music for them here, and in some aspects I help them with recording their music, but I can see the experience currently is different than the experience of, the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Sure.
It's a different experience regarding playing in a band or not playing in a band.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really have a choice to make music on my own as a drummer.
Right.
I didn't have software to monkey around with things and go, oh, look, I made a song by myself. And then by the time that I did have that, I was doing that, but I was also becoming a music producer, and I was interested in doing that for other people.
Same here.
And that became a stepping stone to performing it. There was always a focus on performing it.
Yeah.
And now there can be a whole other experience where you can go all the way from being in your bedroom making music, and then you can get it onto Spotify. And if you're a genius, you can social media manage that to be listened to by more than a few thousand people.
Sure.
There's other pathways, but the experience of playing with other people and hammering music out between people and being like, oh, I don't like that idea, but I like that other idea you said, and all of those experiences, they're different now. And I see bands come in and maybe they haven't had as much of the interactive experience because they've been doing a lot of the singular experience.
Mm-hmm.
Is different.
It's different, no less valid, as you say. It
has a different result.
It does have a different result, and I think, again, going back to teaching, a lot of what I've done with students is to say, okay, you've done it this way, now let's introduce something else. And, hopefully I think that's the same process that we went through. For example, I came up as a guitar player and a bass player. And then I sat down in front of a keyboard. It changed my songwriting style when I would sit down at a different instrument. You know, as you start mastering a different instrument, it's looking through a different paradigm. And I think the same thing is true. You know, I had students who had never done anything except make beats.
Yep.
And so I played for them older hip hop. I played for them some British hip hop, specifically stereo MCs. You know, now stereo MCs have a live drummer. You know, so the feel is going to be different, you know. And I said, okay, so, you know, listen to this. Or listen to, you know, Mitchell Froom production, like a Crowded House production or something, you know. Now, I'm going to teach you how to analytically listen, you know. Pick out that toy piano in, what's that song? Everywhere You Go, You Only Take the Weather.
Mitchell Froom and Chad Blake, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. But little stuff like that to where you're critically listening and saying, oh, you know, that was probably a happy accident, you know, and accidents are in certain ways key to creativity, you know. Take this thing that shouldn't be, you know, it's the difference between how do I imitate versus how do I innovate, you know, the difference between how do I get a drum sound like John Bonham? Okay, cool, that's great, except it's been done, you know, but what if I take, you know, what if I take this compressor and run it through this foot pedal and then run it through, you know, and mic the end of a garden hose, you know, stuff like that. Things that are so completely different, you know. I remember a friend of mine had a technique for miking a kick drum where he would put a plastic 5-gallon water bottle in front of it and then, you know, mic the reverberation from that. Little stuff like that, you know, that you think, why on earth would you do that? But, you know, or we were talking the other day when we were over at Hideout Studios. Kevin Churko had this brilliant thing. He had in the closet, he had a metal trash can, you know, and he would mic the drums and then mic that ambience. There you go. I love it. How perfect. Yes. And Lily stuff. That's, you know, that's good espresso too. But again, you know, it's like, are you trying these different creative things? Because I think that is part of doing something a little different. And that's what an artist does.
I think that, being satisfied with just the fact that you recorded your song is not enough. And when you have software and for the first time you manage to figure out how it works and plug in a mic and you finally get, you know, like, oh, I recorded this song. Like, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate when an artist thinks like, that's it. And now it, you know, DistroKid and boom, it's on Spotify. Okay, you can do that. But I think that I heard Rick Rubin say something about that was so neat. I really want to meet him one day. He seems more like a guru than a music producer. But he said something really interesting when he was talking about what you're talking about. Like, yeah, you could imitate sounds. You could be in the studio with by yourself as the songwriter or with your band and be like, you know, we really want that Bonham sound. And you could work really hard and spend hours and you could get it because it can be totally done.
Sure.
And you will have gotten a Bonham sound. Big yawn. Or you could deal with the drum kit that the drummer actually plays, or maybe one that he borrowed, or the one that's in front of you in the studio. And you could just sort of mixing some of the things that we've already talked about, be present right then and have the intention to get to a point where everybody in the room is bobbing their head going, this rocks.
Yeah.
And be like, okay, well, he's got this terrible old, nasty old drum kit. All right, what are we going to do about that? All right,
Right.
You know, we're going to try this and that, and we're going to do this and that. And therefore, you innovate because that's all you got.
Yeah.
If you only have 2 microphones, make it work.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you're innovating. And then if you end up at a point where everybody's bobbing their head, you've done the thing that we all hope to do, which is to innovate and to do it right there and to create and make something interesting. If all you've done is manage to get the thing that you call the piano onto the software,
Yeah, I mean, it's a good learning experience.
yeah, you
but-
have to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
You have to know how to do it.
But it's interesting that you mentioned that, because to me, I've had this conversation a lot of times about the idea of the power of limits.
Yeah.
My one of my early synths was a Juno 106. Boy, did I just get everything I could out of it, because that was my
Squeeze every
only
last
synth.
drop out of it. Yeah.
I remember I did one of these cassette roulette things where I and a publisher friend of mine went up to was a songwriting organization in I want to say Santa Barbara, but it might have been. But, and listening to a bunch of tapes and stuff, and this one guy's tape, I listened to it and I said, okay, whose is this? And this guy raises his hand. I said, what did you use for a vocal? Because his vocal was it was interesting. It was sort of cloudy. It was, and he got kind of a sheepish look on his face, and he said, well, I don't own a microphone, so I plugged my headphones in and I sang into them. And he was expecting, like people to laugh at him, and a couple of people in the audience started to. And I said, man, that's brilliant. You made something work that would not have been its intended purpose. And isn't that the coolest thing ever,
I mean, he could have said, oh, I can't do it, or oh, I can't make music until I buy a U67.
Right.
But he made it happen.
Yeah.
And it was unique, I'm sure.
It was great.
Right. That's very cool.
And that's the thing is, if there's actual talent, the talent shows through.
Well,
it shines
nothing
through
beats
no
a
matter
song.
what. Right. Exactly. Exactly.
It's hard to ruin a great song. And
exactly right.
It's very, very hard to make a crap song sound good.
We have that phrase, polished turds.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah.
There's plenty of music out there that is brilliantly recorded and in so completely forgettable. Immediately, like 5 minutes later, I don't remember the song, But boy, did it sound good. Great production.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think to me as a creative artist, it's way more fascinating to be able to say, I want to create something that maybe it's not the greatest recording. I mean, you were talking about the Beatles recordings, or I remember listening to recently, I realized that I had an old Stones LP. I think it was like one of the first Stones LPs. Man, there's clams all over that. Charlie Watts is all over the place, man. The dude is like, and brilliant drummer, no question about it.
Did it sound to you like on the great Stones albums that we love and that we know are powerful communications and powerful moments in the history of recorded music? Did the percussion line up? Was the percussion on a grid with the drums?
No. Actually, it's really funny you mentioned that, because I was chatting with a friend of mine who's a remixer.
Yeah.
And he was telling me he had a gig remixing Brick House, the Commodore song.
Yeah.
And he said, I figured, it's disco, it's probably like right on the grid. He said, no, man, it's all over the place, because again, it was played live, and that's that energy. And the energy is not going to conform to a grid,
No, it's wonderful for us to. I think it's a great lesson for any artist to have in mind. What are the important things for me as an artist?
Mm-hmm.
Like, if the audience getting up out of their seats and holding up lighters is important, well, then you need to do what's necessary to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
If them knowing all the words to your song is important to you as an artist, you need to know how to do that.
Yeah.
All of these little things, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be important to you for that. There's some genres of music that it's almost not a plus. Like, keep those vocals buried.
Yeah.
Because we want the guitar to blow our minds.
Yeah.
If you have those importances set out and they're specific for your band or for your songwriting, I feel like that makes really interesting music. That makes albums where like you can put on an album and you listen and you're like, ooh, these guys have a philosophy of what they feel is okay and what's not okay and what's good and what's not good. The first time I heard, the band The Refused, the first time I heard them, I really do like them and I like their songs, but also I listened and I was like, oh, these guys have a philosophy. They have a set of maybe importances or rules.
Yeah.
I think bands that set out not like the drum beat has to be this drum beat, but like conceptual guidelines. Like the drums have to make you anxious. Well, then you know what to do to make that happen.
Yeah.
And if you don't feel anxious when you're hearing the drum track, if you don't feel jittery, you didn't do it yet.
Yeah, yeah.
I love those kind of conceptual guidelines. I feel like when we listen to music, there's artists and bands, maybe music producers too, who somehow make that happen. And then there are ones that don't sound like they're doing that.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because a lot of those guidelines you're talking about are not musical in nature at all. They're emotional.
Yes.
And that's what music is about, isn't
For
it?
sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
You know, I don't want to make a perfect pop song. Maybe some people do, and that's valid too.
Yeah.
Great for them. I don't want to make a perfect pop song. I want to make a song that sticks in someone's head. You know, and it could be perfect. It could be complete utter shit. But if I'm remembering it, days later, if it pops into my head, then that's a successful song.
That's right. And well, you just set out a not easy one. That's not an easy, it's not an easy one.
No.
But it requires very specific things in order for the person who listens to it. You call up your buddy and you say, remember that song that I played you yesterday? Can you hum it right now?
Yeah, exactly. Did it touch that nerve?
Do you want to make people cry? You could do that.
Yeah,
Those kind of emotional guidelines, I find that fascinating, because then as a composer and as a songwriter, but also as a music producer, if I'm just the guy that's helping a band get to wherever the guidelines are that they set, I can be very creative about how we get there. Because if they've set a guideline like, these drums have to make you get up and feel like dancing. I know what to do.
Yeah. And it's not just the sound of the drums. I mean, yes, that's part of it, but it's also, I want to coach you on how you're playing that, I want you to think about that, I mean, to me, it's most apparent like when you're working with a vocalist, and of course, in 99 point ad infinitum % of that kind of music, it is the vocal. Everything else is wrapped around the vocal. And to a certain extent, everything else, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, because of course it does, but it only matters in the context of that vocal performance.
That's right.
And the human voice is so capable of that emotion, of making someone cry, of making someone want to get up and dance, it's so much about that. And really, what is it we're shaping? We're shaping something around that performance. And I want to pull that out of the artist, I'm in the habit, like when I'm working with a vocalist, I don't just sit down and say, okay, let's do it. I say, come on, let's talk about this.
Yeah.
What made you write this song?
Yeah.
What were you thinking of? All of that. And then you get them in front of the microphone, and then they're going to sing it completely differently, because that's where their head is, And
it's an important thing. Having, working with vocalists, of course, there are physical things like, breathing and placement of the voice, and, being a good music recorder and not like wrecking your singer by making them sing a certain way for a certain amount of time.
Right.
All of those kinds of things are very physical, but the headspace that you just describe of like you're the music producer and okay, this next song, all right, talk to me about what this is about. Like getting not just me to understand, but getting it in the headspace right now, because here's the microphone, we're going to do this now.
Yeah.
Bring that headspace back around is important. I think that you're right, because not only is the vocalist, in a lot of cases, the writer of the words, a lot of vocalists that I've had in the studio, you know, when it's time and the microphone's right there, they're have a little bit of like, I'm thinking about notes and pitch, and like I got to breathe correctly, and I heard myself sing this in the car and it sounded terrible, and like there's a lot of noise going on that has nothing to do with the message of the song.
Right.
So talking about it and bringing it, that, because it's the most important thing.
It is. And it's, I mean, to me, I think that's interesting, being able to work with an artist like that. You know, I've worked with not just singers, but I've worked with voiceover actors, and, you know, people who do, working with a couple of people right now on audiobooks, you know. It's the same thing.
Sure.
It's coaching, you know, how did you say that? What did what you said make me feel? Did it bring the emotion that I wanted, that I intended to bring forth?
Yeah.
You know, and that's such a challenge in itself, you know, because there's 100 different ways to do it right. There are probably 100 different ways to do it wrong as well, but who's the judge?
There's like 10,000 ways to do it wrong. There's like 100 ways to do it right.
Yeah, okay, fair, yeah.
I guess it depends on who's listening.
Well, yeah, exactly. And, you know, again, that comes down to the classic question of how do you define success?
Well,
You know?
do you want to talk about that?
Oh, God, no.
I'll tell you an interesting thing about success and music that my wife and I were talking about today. I don't know, maybe... I don't know how many years ago. Many years ago, I came upon a feeling and a thought that if you just wrote music, you know, I'm talking about us as songwriters now, like if I just wrote some music and I wrote it in my little studio here and nobody else ever heard it, did I accomplish a goal? Did I make art? Does art have to be exchanged with somebody, even if it's only playing it for my dog or my kids or my family, or, you know, ever widening for the 10 people at the VFW hall?
Right.
Does it have to be exchanged in order for it to be validly exist as art?
Yeah.
And I came to a conclusion this many years ago that it must be exchanged. Otherwise, it is only of value as potential value.
Okay.
It has potential value, but it has no actual value until it is exchanged and the communication goes to the other person. And I have thought that very much for many years.
It's interesting.
Potential value, and I mean even as like the math of potential value, can have a lot of potential value. It can have so much potential value that not using it to actually do what it could do potentially to people's hearts and minds, say, would be like wrong, bad.
Sure, yeah.
Like, so a song could have potential value. Actual value is when it gets exchanged. I've thought that for many, many, many years.
It's an interesting perspective, yeah.
Recently, because I have, you know, lots of songs in the cabinet of unreleased things, and I started to think about, like, well, do they really have only potential value? And I started to think about the hillbilly guitar picker sitting on his porch after having worked his ass off all day, and fingers probably sore as hell from working, let alone playing this guitar, sits down and plays a song that his friend taught him, his parents taught him, whatever. He's on the porch by himself. Like, no possibility of any communication with another. does that, because I put myself in those shoes and I thought, you know what a great relief to my soul that would have been if I had been that person, and I get to now take a half an hour, have a little drink, sit on the porch and play this thing out into the ether. Nobody's there.
Yep.
The only person that's there is me. What's it doing for me?
Right.
It's healing me. It's making me feel better. Maybe it's making me feel closer to ancestors. Maybe it's calling in ancestors to help me feel good about life situations right now.
Maybe it's just changing your brain waves and relaxing you, whatever
Maybe it's
it
just
is.
relaxing,
Yeah,
right?
it's therapeutic.
So I have now completely changed my my view, because I've forgotten about the incredible value to yourself.
It's interesting because when you first brought this up, I was thinking, oh, I'm not sure I agree. And that's my perspective on it, is that a lot of times, maybe we're just doing it for ourselves. Maybe it's a tree falling in the forest.
It can be.
Now,
then we bring in other questions of like, well, what was our intention? Do we feel bad because we never did do that thing? We never did get the A&R from Geffen Records to listen to our thing or whatever, thing. Okay, yeah, you can regret just about anything if you make an effort to.
Sure.
And sure, I still do believe that a song has potential value, and until you exchange it with people, you won't know that value. But now I realize I'm a little older. I'm like, you know what? But there is a very beautiful value to what it can do for you. I have played old songs of mine that I've written and produced that, only 3 or 4 people in the universe know about. Yeah. And I play it and I'm like, damn, that is pretty good. And it makes me feel a little bit better.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, look at that.
Yeah, I've got songs like that too. It's like, oh.
I'm wrong about my earlier hypothesis.
Well, I don't know. It's interesting that you mention intention, because if you think about the creative process, I would say that yes, there are artists, as we were speaking earlier about, artists who hear it all in their heads, and then the goal is to make that final creation, that thing that you heard.
Yeah.
But there's also the whole idea of just, as you said earlier, decisions, making commitments to certain things, trying certain things. Maybe by the time you're done with that song, it sounds nothing like what you thought it was going to be, but it's still a valid creation, right? I mean, again, I'll go back to Beatles, I mean, I'm sure that when any of them came in the studio with this idea, hey, I got this idea for a tune, did they envision what it was going to be? Probably not.
No.
Because so much of it was just, let's try this. Let's, experiment with that.
Can you imagine?
Oh, yeah.
To be a fly on the wall then. Well, what about, we can also think of it in terms of, I think of it in terms of Michelangelo.
Yeah.
He may have, after he finished David, he had this extra chunk over here of stone, and he's at his studio, and he, over the next several months, he turns this chunk of stone and he says to himself as an artist, he says, you know what, I want to try something that I've never seen before. We do all these realistic statues. I'm going to try doing something that's just geometric.
Yeah,
right?
abstract.
Abstract. I'm going to try doing abstracts. He's only saying it to himself.
Yeah.
He is an artist of indisputable, it can't be disputed, right? He does this thing. He makes this creation. And when he's done, he looks at it and he goes, huh, how about that? So I guess, and then he thinks whatever he wants to think about it.
Yeah.
So is that thing, which nobody else in the world knows about it because it was locked away in a cupboard somewhere, is that art? And what is its value? Well, according to my theory, it has extremely high potential value.
Right.
But it also had really high value for that artist, because he looked at it and he thought, and he thought whatever he thought. Who knows how that affected the other things that he would then go on to create?
That he might have been more well known for. And that's the other thing too, when you get into art in that sense, especially if you're an established artist, there are expectations, and there are a lot of artists who get pigeonholed in that, and then, I remember I was a big Jethro Tull fan at one point, and I had the privilege of actually having dinner with Ian and a bunch of people.
Really?
Yeah.
How neat.
I was an artist relations guy, and I ended up accidentally interviewing him.
Wow.
At a music messe, and we all became friends over the years. He and I, and his road manager in particular, and I got a call from Kenny, his road manager, one time, and he said, "Yeah, Ian's going to be in town, and he's doing a classical music tour. He's doing his orchestral stuff." And I went to see that tour, and I was like, this is a completely different side of this musician. This is not at all what I have grown to expect from him, And did he sell a lot of albums from it? I don't know. Did he care? Probably not, But again, it's the expectations thing, it's the David Bowie thing, reinventing themselves. And are you going to lose fans? Probably. But you're going to gain new fans because you're trying something completely different. And that takes a lot of courage, I think, to be able to say, here's this bit of art that, as you say, has potential, but it's completely different than what people expect of me. Is it valid? Of course it's valid, Michelangelo doing an abstract piece of sculpture, Hey, it looks like a flying saucer, whatever it is, man, it's like...
Killed his reputation.
Yeah, whatever, but it probably was of tremendous value to him.
Yeah.
The same way, Ian Anderson doing orchestral music was probably of tremendous value to him. In fact, I know it was, and it was really good too. I still have the CD somewhere, but it was, a lot of people would say, oh, that's self-indulgent, you're just trying this, you're not a classical musician. You know what? If I'm making classical music, I'm a classical musician, because I decided that I am. Yeah. Who is going to tell you otherwise,
Well, there are people who will tell you otherwise.
Absolutely. The question is, how valid is their opinion?
Yeah.
I'm doing this to do it for me, in that sense. Let me wrap with a question that I ask almost everyone I interview.
Oh, will I pass?
You will.
I don't know.
You will, absolutely, because there's no wrong answer here.
Yeah, that's what they always say.
I know, right?
There's no wrong answer. Okay, I'll try.
Okay, so we've been talking now about coming up in a different sort of creative environment and all of these different approaches. And of course, now, as we said, not only is the creative aspect of music different, but so is the way we consume music, and I hate that term, but the way we hear music, the way music is valued in the world, everything else. What do you tell 15-year-old you coming up now?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I thought you were going to say 15-year-old then, but 15-year-old now, 15-year-old me now. Ooh.
Completely different world, right?
Well, as I said, I have a son who's a guitar player and guitar teacher, and if I would probably say the same thing to him that I would say to the 15-year-old me now, which is, you will find out later that being more highly skilled at your instrument than you even think you need to be is going to help you make money. Be much more skilled than you think you need to be, and just be great at your instrument. Takes hard work. And I say that because I know that my 15-year-old self had very little discipline. And also, because we talked about the value of music and the artist's road is challenging, I would say to 15-year-old me, be flexible with how you make money. Don't be flexible with your art.
Really good point, because, especially in this day and age, a lot of artists have to make money in a different way. If you're lucky enough to be able to make money and still be in the creative arts somehow or another, that's great. But man, there's a lot of people who are waiting tables while they're looking for an acting gig or whatever,
I think, and third thing, I think I would cover it. The third one is, well, I don't know how I would say it to my 15-year-old self, but the important point of point number 3 is people are incredibly important. Connections to people is incredibly important. It doesn't matter if it's the busboy at the restaurant where you're doing the gig. What matters is meet people, know that they're important, and that the journey of music requires other people, and you're going to see a lot of the same people, same people that you abuse on the way up. You might meet up on the way down.
Yeah.
It requires networking. The idea of success in music, making money in music, and there are lots of different ways to make it, requires contacting people, knowing when you vibe well with people, knowing when you don't vibe well with people, knowing a lot of people. And it's, I'm not a gregarious. I am a gregarious person. I do love people, but I'm also happy in my little cave. I'm happy in my recording studio, and if somebody doesn't say, dude, you got to get out more, I might be in here for months and not go out and see gigs. And it's incredibly important. If you want to be relevant to other musicians, relevant to other music producers, relevant to the scene, you need to meet people, know people, chit chat with people, and know that people are important. And I think I didn't have to tell my 15-year-old self this, but I have told my boys this when they were little and growing up, is that treating people with respect and dignity as a square one is like manners. And manners make everything go smoothly. I mean, sure, some people will show you that they don't deserve respect, but they'll show you.
Yeah.
Until then, everybody deserves respect and dignity. And when I was 15 and I was meeting and knowing people, there are several people that I met and knew who then later they're running a film studio, or they're running a record label, or they're just good people to know who would let you sleep on their couch.
The value of the human connection.
Yeah.
I think it's important not only, as you say, for a career, but even for creativity. Again, we go back to that same idea of collaborating on a creation.
Yeah.
And I think, you hit the nail on the head there. That's so important. That communication between people, I think, it's the key to so much.
It really is. Here's a couple old guys from New York saying it's important. It is. It's been your experience. It's been my experience. People are important. It doesn't mean all people are equally important in your life or my life, because, that guy that was very mean to you or nasty to you at a club when you played a gig with him, okay, maybe he's a little less important for you to have a healthy and wonderful life. Mm-hmm. But people are important. Connections to people is super important. Yeah, I don't know what those... now I can't remember what my 3 answers were, but you're going to have to send me an email with them, because they were good. I think those are... I could live by those 3.
Okay, we'll summarize it. I'll send you the transcript. Yeah. Thaddeus Corea, thank you for being my guest.
My pleasure.
My pleasure. Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.